Within the pipe by size feature that is part of the 2007 release, there are actually 3 different ways that you can display pipe at once in a given view of a drawing. This is illustrated in this drawing here, where we have our 2-line, our 1-line, followed by our 1-line graphical, which is used by both the 1-inch and the 4-inch. These controls for these thresholds to switch between graphical, 1-line, 1-line graphical, 1-line, and 2-line is controlled by the system definition for the pipe system that's used. So for instance, these pipes are all chilled water supply. You'll see here. So if we go into our Style Manager, we look at the system itself, you'll see that we have thresholds here. So for all pipes that are 8 inches or less, it's going to display them as just 1 line. And for components that are 4 inches or less, they're going to display them as graphical 1 line. Now the main difference between the two, outside of the appearance of connectors, and of course that can actually be changed afterwards, we'll show you that in a minute, but the main difference is going to be the size that's displayed for inline MV parts. So you'll see here that we've defined a MV part plot length, and I'll illustrate that right here. So you'll see that once we've reached the threshold for graphical 1-line display, which we see in both the 4-inch and the 1-inch pipe, the size of these ball valve symbols are actually scaled according to the size defined in the previous dialog. So in that case it was 1/8 of an inch. So regardless of the scale that's set here, the actual size that's going to be used in graphical is going to be scaled accordingly, so that when you place a viewport with the corresponding scale, the plot length will be 1/8 of an inch. This can be illustrated by changing the scale here. So let's go ahead and change it to a 1/4 scale and regen the model. You'll see that the graphical valve symbols scaled along with the annotations, but both the 1-line and 2-line representations for the MV parts did not scale, and that is because those don't scale. They will always stay their absolute size in the drawing itself, whereas the graphical size will scale accordingly along with this. So if we want to illustrate the change that's going to make with the 4-inch valve, we can go ahead and adjust our threshold in our Style Manager. We will go in here and let's set this at 3 inches. So you'll see that we've now switched over to 1 line here, yet we've maintained graphical here. And the reason why this is instated is in an instance where we may have upwards of an 18-inch valve here that's going to be quite large. If the scaling is set so that that doesn't display too large, most likely if we were to display an unscaled version of the valve here in a 4-inch or a 1-inch, it's going to be so small that when you plot it out on a viewport, it's just going to look like a blob. So basically, when we change the plot length, that allows us to have a symbol that's readable on the drawing. And this is illustrated if we turn off the threshold here in our pipe system definition. We're going to completely turn off graphical display, and you'll see that this symbol became even smaller, so small that most likely it's going to plot out as just a blob. So that's the reason why that graphical threshold is in place. So if we go ahead and reinstate the threshold here, and we set it to 4 inches, so that we have 2 examples of the graphical, we can go into our Display Manager and see that now in the plan representation, which is what we're using right now to display pipe, has been broken down into a number of different display components. These are new to this release. You won't recognize them if you're used to previous releases. You'll see that we've broken down into graphical as well as just standard connector and center line, one line here. So this is actually going to control the appearance of the center line when viewing in simple one line. The center line is going to be the center line that's used in a two-line representation, and this is going to be the center line that's used for graphical. So if I wanted to go ahead and override this, and let's just set it to green for graphical, let's set it to red for one line, and let's set our contour, which is the actual outside of the pipe, to, let's set it to blue for illustration purposes, and we hit OK. You'll see that the colors did change, and you can see that even though these are the same systems, we're seeing different display of the main line here, and that's because they're actually different components. Of course, the fittings themselves did not change colors because they're a separate object type, and we would have needed to have changed the settings for that object type, the pipe fitting object type, for those color changes to correspond. But this is a good way to illustrate how those different components have different impacts. And the one other item to point out here is that by default, these fittings within a one line will have a connector display, whereas they will not have a connector display on the graphical, and that's illustrated here within the display manager. If we were to go to our pipe fittings and look at plan, you'll see that the graphical connector has been turned off. If we were to go ahead and turn it back on, you'll see that we now have connectors on our graphicals. But in general, since these hatches can be so small and they do not scale accordingly like the MB parts, you may run into issues where you get blobs as well on the connectors themselves. So by default, those symbols for the connector are turned off as such right here.